In the early 1980s, General Motors was under assault. The Japanese manufacturers were ascending, high quality, customers loved them, and GM's cars were underwhelming, quality was bad, recalls were rampant, and they knew something had to change. That became Saturn Corporation, and this is the incredibly sad story of how GM killed Saturn and killed the hope of what could have been a great car company. So before we jump in here, I want to just say that I am a Saturn fan. I actually worked with one of their retailers in the 90s. I've actually been to Spring Hill, Tennessee, the factory. I was there for 4 or 5 days worth of training. I've toured the factory. I've met the people who actually made the cars. I've owned a Saturn. I had friends who owned Saturn. I'm a big, big fan of it. As a matter of fact, my coffee cup right here, this is probably 1996. You can't really see it anymore. The logo is gone, but that used to be a Saturn logo right there. I still use this coffee cup every single day. So I'm a huge fan. And to me, it's one of the most heartbreaking stories of what happened. Car companies come and go. Oldsmobile's been closed down, Edsel, of course. But Saturn had so much promise and so much goodwill, and it all just disintegrated. In the early 1980s, GM got a study done of how would you build, design, engineer, and sell a car if you were unburdened by current standards. You know, you think about any car company, they have sometimes a century of baggage, of expectations, of this is how we do business, right? The design department, this is how we design. The engineering department, the flow of work down to the labor unions and the people making it in the factory, and then of course the sales process. And General Motors was losing to the resurgent Japanese models in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. And they commissioned this study. What would you do if you weren't burdened by any of these expectations? And they called it the Saturn study. When it came out, it was really supposed to be a way for them to take lessons and apply them to the individual divisions within GM. But then CEO Roger Smith got so excited, he decided they're going to launch a whole new car company to directly compete with the imports, Saturn Corporation. So what they did, I need to check my notes here. They commissioned a prototype, and the first one was rejected. It looked too much like an Oldsmobile. And they went out and they came up with another one, which eventually became the Saturn Car Company. In the mid-1980s, they founded the company as a wholly owned subsidiary of General Motors. So it was not a division. It was a subsidiary of GM. They put in place the management. They went out and they found some land in Spring Hill, Tennessee. And they started to build their factory. And for 2 years, they built the factory. They hired some employees. They trained them up. And by 1990, they built their first car. Now, a couple of quick notes here. First off, General Motors is a very top-down company. The individual divisions have some autonomy, but they are told what to do by management. And in this case, General Motors invested an estimated $5 billion into Saturn. And to do that, they basically went to the other divisions and said, I know you'd like to design this new car, but we're giving all this money over here to develop a brand new one. And it built up a lot of resentment. This becomes super important later in the story because Chevy, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, I know I read an interview one time where I think it was the president of Chevy said, you know, they wasted all this money in Saturn. Imagine what he could have done with $5 billion to redesign a whole new series of cars to sell out to the American public. So there's a lot of resentment inside GM. But, so they put all this money into Saturn, an almost $2 billion factory, and began to launch their car. Now they launched with two or three, depending on how you want to count it, a four-door sedan, a wagon version, and a two-door coupe. And initially it wasn't a sales success. They sold just over 1,800 their first year, but after that it started to take off. And for the next many years, Saturn was among the top brands in terms of reliability, owner satisfaction, and initial quality, even up in the rarefied air of Lexus. In only their first 5 years, they sold over 1 million cars. So by 1995, they were an established success. They also were profitable. GM didn't break out their finances to be separate, but they had built and engendered a generation of buyers who loved their cars, loved the sales experience, the no haggle, one price for everybody, reliable and durable, plastic panels, no dents. Sure, it can be chipped, but these cars were fantastic. Yeah, they had some problems, they had some recalls, they had some major recalls, but the company didn't try to avoid it. The company stepped up to it and said, we have a problem and we are going to take care of you, which only built more good faith among the people who bought it. Consider what GM did with other recalls, which was to hide it, ignore it, or go to court over it, or try to minimize it and only do these few cars over here. In one case, Saturn recalled 300,000 cars to fix something because they faced up to it and they built so much goodwill. In 1994, they had the first Saturn Homecoming. 40,000 people took their summer vacation to travel to Tennessee in their Saturn to go to the Saturn factory and spend time at the cultural center of an automobile manufacturer.
44,000 people spent their vacations with us.
Now, some people looked at Saturns and didn't really like them. Some people thought that it was just a cult. But the people who bought it absolutely loved it. First reviews I remember reading from Car and Driver about Saturn said that obviously the designers could see because the cars looked good. They could feel because the cars drove good, but they couldn't hear because the cars were noisy. And it's true. Saturn developed their own engine, their own transmission. They built them all at Spring Hill. That engine had a timing chain for reliability, and yes, it was a little noisy. It was not quite as refined as, say, a Corolla or a Civic of the time, but it had a little bit more spirit and a lot more community feel around it. Nobody looks at their Civic and says, man, I love that. I wish I could go to my Honda factory and spend a weekend. So Saturn really did something special. They had the t-shirts and the coffee mugs and everything else, and they were profitable. Checking my notes here, by 95 they sold their 1 millionth car. By 1999 they sold their 2 millionth car, and somewhere right after that, about 2002, the wheels came off. Now we can't know what General Motors and the inner workings of such a global company really said, but it was obvious they weren't happy with the profitability of Saturn, and the market began changing. So in 1999 they introduced the L series, and that was their mid-size car to compete with the Honda Accord. But instead of allowing Saturn to do what they did the first time, which was to go forward and develop their own mid-size car to compete directly with the imports, they took a global platform and said, here, make this a Saturn. It was the first Saturn without the plastic body panels, and it was built at another factory that was a General Motors factory. Now, this is important in just a minute because the Saturn factory, the workers there, the line workers, the factory workers actually building the cars, had a different arrangement from the rest of the United Auto Workers. They had an arrangement that gave them more responsibility. The factory was actually innovatively designed so that parts of it actually moved with the worker. They had the right to press a button if things were wrong and stop the whole line to keep quality high. Part of that was they had more responsibility, but they were rewarded with profit sharing as well. And something the UAW supported at the beginning, they started not support so much. The L Series was forced on Saturn. They weren't allowed to design their own car. They were forced to take a General Motors platform, a General Motors engine, and a General Motors transmission built in a General Motors factory with a standard UAW agreement. Began to really water down the brand. Now, it was reviewed average. It was okay. But 2002 is when the wheels really started to come off. General Motors, I believe, felt they needed to really boost sales of Saturn. They needed this to really, really succeed, to throw off tons of profit. But because of their top-down nature, because of the General Motors hierarchy telling divisions what they need to do, they went to Saturn and said, you know all that money we gave you to begin with? I'm sorry, it's allocated to other divisions now. You're going to take what we give you. So in 2002, they introduced the View, a really cool little sport utility. But again, none of the plastic panels, nothing that was Saturn. It was a European GM design brought here to America. In 2003, they brought the Ion. So for some reason, they decided that the SL series of small cars, the name didn't work. They changed it to an Ion, obliterated all that good will that they developed among all their people, all of their buyers, and they came out with the Ion. This was not a Saturn. This was based on a General Motors global platform that eventually became the Chevy Cruze. It used a General Motors, not a Chevy, a General Motors engine, a General Motors transmission. The Saturn platform, engine, and transmission were gone. Also, I believe they did use the plastic body panels on it, but it wasn't a Saturn. Interestingly, Car and Driver, and I remember this, and they actually still have it on their website. I went and pulled it up, and you can see this quote right here. They decided it was the worst designed automobile in a decade. Ruined, absolutely ruined Saturn. But General Motors plowed ahead. In 2005, just 2 years later, they introduced the Relay minivan, which was really just a Chevy or a Pontiac minivan with a Saturn logo on it and a few cosmetic changes, no plastic panels. The L Series was canceled because of slow sales. Then in 2007, they introduced the Sky Roadster, which was pretty cool, but Pontiac had one too, right? The Aurora midsize sedan was released. Again, another General Motors Europe product brought to America, but they were given the only right to that midsize sedan until Saturn ultimately collapsed. And they brought in a slightly larger SUV, the Outlook, again, based on another General Motors platform. So all of what made Saturn disappeared, except for the fact they wouldn't actually haggle with you. That was 2007. In 2008, December, and into early 2009, General Motors was being hit with the recession. They sat in front of Congress and said, hey, we're going to have to restructure our business. And to do so, we're going to have to reduce the brands. One of those is Saturn. They kept Chevy. They kept Buick. They kept Cadillac. They kept GMC. But they were going to cut Saturn. They offered it for sale, and Penske actually was in conversations to buy Saturn, buy the rights to the name, but they didn't want to own any factories. They wanted the rights to build Saturn vehicles in other plants, so they started talking to other companies like Renault, Nissan. But those eventually fell through, and GM just closed Saturn down entirely. A car company was launched to revolutionize the way Americans could design, engineer, build, and sell cars that actually got people to love their cars enough to go to the factory, spend their vacations, be repeat buyers, was squandered by General Motors in the pursuit of profit by forcing more GM products to just be rebranded. They stopped treating Saturn like an individual company and more like another division. And one thing I read that kind of highlights it all is that UAW agreement they had, the factory workers, it's the size of a brochure, not hundreds of pages like most UAW agreements, because the factory workers believed in what they were doing, they believed in the customer first, and they believed in their leadership to do the right thing. And the leadership did. The UAW got tired of it. There was some resentment among the UAW that why should Saturn be getting bonuses if the rest of us aren't? And they went to the Saturn workers 3 times with the international UAW agreement and said, you need to sign this. And they were voted down 3 separate times. But once GM started building other cars in other GM factories and branding them as Saturns, it all started to collapse. This is the saddest story in my mind in American automobile history. I understand Edsel and AMC went away and all these other ones, but Saturn was, I really believe it was special. I really believe it was set up to be something special. It took a massive amount of money. And I understand that General Motors needed a return on their investment. But they built up so much goodwill.
But we were all in it together, the way we always have been.
And then in the early 2000s, in the interest of profits, they stopped letting Saturn be Saturn. They alienated all those buyers, and they just started pushing, honestly, junk through Saturn dealerships. That's the legacy of Saturn. And it makes me extremely sad on a personal level. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a couple of new things. Please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe. And if you had a Saturn and you loved it, or if you were at a Saturn homecoming, please leave me a comment below. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.